All right, everybody. Welcome, welcome. We are piling in the chat. Thank you guys so much for introducing yourselves, shouting out your lands and where you're from. Good afternoon. My name is Kalia D. Pitts, and I am the Director of Engagement Initiatives at Frameworks Institute. Welcome to our very first Culture Change Roundtable. We're going to be talking today about whether or not Americans are thinking more systemically. Before we get started, I will answer the question I saw pop up a few times. I'll answer in the chat where you can find the music if you so enjoyed it. It was provided by a Philadelphia artist, which is where I'm hailing from, Lennon Lance. And before we get into our actual meat and potatoes today, we're going to have a quick word from our Framework CEO, Nat Kendall-Taylor.
Hello to everybody out there. Hope you're doing well, hanging in there. My name is Nat Kendall-Taylor. I'm CEO of the Frameworks Institute, and I am incredibly excited to welcome you all today to the first roundtable discussion that's part of the Culture Change Project, and super excited to hear what my colleague Drew Volmert has to say as he presents some fresh from the field framing findings and then digs in with two absolutely wonderful, fantastic guests that I'm so excited to hear from today, Abdul El-Sayed and Ista Srivastava, who are going to be taking us through kind of their thoughts, their reaction to these findings. They're going to dig in, tell us a little bit more about what they mean, and how they're thinking about using these results, these recommendations, these new findings in their work. So again, welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us. Take care. Hope this is helpful. Over and out.
All right. Thank you from Nat, who is joining us today from across the world. And thank you, everybody, again. Oh, gosh, there are quite a few of you guys there together. Welcome. All right, we have an amazing crowd gathered today. We have our Frameworks team here. I'm joined by my colleagues. We have kind of behind the scenes backstage. We have Jay and Cameron, who are from our comms team, and they're making all the fun things happen. Jay is actually going to be live tweeting this event. So if you saw on that first slide, you can follow us at Frameworks Institute on Twitter, and you can use the following hashtag if you want to follow with the conversation. I'm also joined by Corinne Whedon, who is our Director of Communications team. She'll be joining me in the chat to answer some of your questions. And of course, we have Drew Volmert, who is from our research team and is going to be telling you more about the really wonderful findings that we have from this project. So before I go ahead and introduce our roundtable guest speakers, Drew, why don't you give us a little bit of background as to what we're even gathering around the table to talk about?
Great. Thanks so much, Kalia. It is so great to be with you all. So excited to see everyone here and to have a chance to share some findings about our Culture Change Project, which we just couldn't be more excited about, and really, really glad to have Ishta and Abdul here to discuss this project. So really excited to dig in with both of you. I'm going to set things up really quickly and just very briefly provide a little bit of background about the project, what we've been doing, and this finding that we're going to be focusing on today around systemic thinking. I should say up front, this is just one finding from this big set of work that we've been doing. There's a broader set of findings in a report that you can find. We'll be sharing resources later. You may have already in the chat, but I encourage you to go look into those. So the Culture Change Project is exploring how culture is shifting in response to the social upheavals that we've been going through over the last couple of years. It's important to highlight up front that it differs in important ways from public opinion research, which we're all really familiar with. And a lot of tracking work, a lot of tracking projects are tracking public opinion. So they're looking at how support for a policy changes over time, or how approval ratings for the president might change over time. What we're doing here is something different. We're tracking shifts in the underlying cultural mindsets, the deep assumptions and implicit understandings that shape how we all think about the world, and those understandings that are part of American culture. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about cultural mindsets. We're talking about those deep ways of making sense of the world that are part of a group's shared culture. Cultural mindsets are important because they're the soil in which our society grows. the terrain on which our politics happens, the ground in which we make decisions about our shared social world. And in turn, when that ground gets churned up, as it is right now, that affects what kinds of things grow and what can happen in the years to come. So understanding the ways in which the culture, the soil of culture is changing right now has a lot of implications for all of us in the years going forward. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking with Ishita and Abdul about. So this project started at the outset of the pandemic as the world was getting thrown into upheaval from the pandemic, the economic disruptions attached to it, and then ultimately some other things, the racial justice uprisings of the summer of 2020, January 6th, we piled up these social upheavals over time. We wanted to understand whether and how culture was in fact shifting in response to these events. We know from lots of good social scientific and historical research that times of social upheaval can also be times of cultural upheaval. And so we wanted to do some research to understand whether and how that was happening. We have focused in this research not on attitudes toward the events themselves or to specific aspects of what we've been going through. So we haven't been really looking at attitudes towards masks or vaccination, for instance, but rather the broader cultural mindsets that we all use to make sense of big social issues, health, the economy, race and racism, government and democracy, how those cultural mindsets are being used in this time to make sense of our broader world and the ways in which those are shifting. To do this, we've been using a mix of qualitative and quantitative methods. So we started with some focus group research in May and June of 2020, and we've been doing focus groups every few months since then. We also started fielding a tracking survey in August of 2020, where we were, again, not tracking attitudes towards specific events of the moment, but strength of endorsement of different cultural mindsets, things like individualism and systemic thinking, the kind of cultural mindsets we're going to be talking about today. We've supplemented those focus groups with some individual interviews to really dig deep into how people are using these mindsets in the moment. Okay, so the finding that we're really going to focus on today centers on design systems thinking. So the idea that the way our society works is shaped by a broader set of social systems. We have found in this research that design systems thinking is rising. Now, we all know that American culture is highly individualistic. People tend to start with the assumption that our outcomes in life are shaped by our individual choices, which are in turn determined by our level of drive, our willpower. This is a familiar mindset that we've seen across all of our research over the course of 20 plus years across social issues. This pops up in different ways in different areas. So in thinking about the economy, people rely on bootstraps thinking to assume that that's what shapes people's economic outcomes. On health, people tend to assume that people's health outcomes are shaped by their individual lifestyle choices, diet, exercise, whether they smoke or not. Systemic thinking has tended to be in the background. It's an available mindset for all of us. It's been part of American culture for a while, but we have found in our research across time that people are less likely to appeal to this idea that social systems shape our outcomes than the idea that individual choice does. From the beginning of this project, we've actually seen a rise in systemic talk and thinking. From the outset in our focus groups in May of 2020, we saw people were appealing more, were talking more about the ways in which social systems are both designed and shape people's life outcomes. We've seen that on the rise, gaining strength, although on some issues more than other. This still remains weaker than individualism, so we don't want to overstate the finding here. We've seen a real rise in systemic thinking, but it's not like Americans are suddenly thinking systemically across the board. And it really is important to highlight, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, that the salience of systemic thinking varies by issue and by group. So we have seen, not surprisingly, that there tends to be more of a reliance on systemic thinking among younger people, among Democrats, than among older people and Republicans. So this is just one graph from our tracking survey. It's a tiny slice of what we found. But what it illustrates is the evolution of systemic thinking over the course of the period when we fielded the tracking survey from August of 2020 through December of 2021. We have some more recent results that aren't included here, but hold up this pattern. We have seen over the course of this period a slight rise in systemic thinking, and I think it's important to highlight here, this is a continuation of a trend that if we had started fielding the survey before August of 2020, we're quite confident that there was lower levels of systemic thinking, lower endorsement of systemic thinking before. What we see here is actually we're asking people to choose between a statement that encapsulates individualism and a statement that encapsulates systemic thinking. We see that individualism remains dominant, but there's a steady rise in people's inclination to prefer that systemic mindset, to choose that as the thing that they agree with more. Again, we all hold in mind multiple ways of thinking at any given time. So we're not saying that anyone is thinking just individualistically or just systemically, but we see that people are increasingly relying on systemic thinking over time. Okay, I want to conclude here before we open up our conversation with a discussion of the ways in which systemic thinking differs in its dominance across different issues. So, as I mentioned, when people think about health, we see health individualism, this idea that our individual lifestyle choices shape our health. That has historically been very dominant over more ecological or systemic understanding of health as something that's shaped by broader social systems and environments. Interestingly, despite the fact that we've been in the middle of a health crisis and you might have expected that to provide a big boost to systemic thinking on health, this is actually the area where we've seen the least change, the least increase in systemic thinking. On the economy, on the other hand, over the course of the last decade or so, I would say from our qualitative research, we've increasingly seen more systemic thought. And there's historically been, over the last 40, 50 years, a reliance on a combination of market naturalism and bootstraps thinking. So the idea that if individuals just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, they'll succeed within a market that is shaped purely by natural forces. We've seen an increasing recognition that the economy is actually designed by our policy choices, our collective decisions. That has actually become more dominant than this more individualistic way of thinking. And over the course of the pandemic, over the course of the last couple of years, we've actually seen that further strengthened. Finally, on thinking about racism, we did some focus group research right before the racial justice uprising, so in March and April of 2020, and found that across different racial groups, there was actually an interpersonal model of racism dominated. There was a tendency to assume that racism is located in individual bias and prejudice. Of course it is, but there was a tendency not to think about racism also in structural terms, to see the ways in which racism is built into structures and institutions and systems. As a result of the uprisings and over the course of the last couple of years, we have seen a shift in that direction. We still see more interpersonal modeling of racism, but more structural thinking about racism has become prevalent. And this is uneven, as I said, across groups and across racial groups as well. We certainly see more structural thinking about racism, for instance, among Black Americans than white Americans. Okay, so with that, that's my quick overview of the project and this finding. That's a way we can jump off. I'm going to hand things back to Kalia to introduce our panelists, and I'm looking forward to talking, Ishta and Abdul, with both of you about this work.
Thanks, Drew. I was talking and I was on mute, as if we haven't been doing this for 2 years. Okay, so that is, I'm seeing some really great questions in the chat. Please continue to ask your questions. We are going to try to answer them as much as possible if they're not going to be answered in this amazing discussion. Speaking of, let's get to the amazing discussion. As mentioned, we have two very insightful and, I mean, just really awesome guest speakers to share with you today. First, I would like to introduce to you Ishita Srivastava, who is a cultural strategist and producer who believes in the power of storytelling and pop culture to move hearts and minds and transform social norms to create lasting social change. With a decade of experience working at the intersection of social change movements, media, and pop culture, Ishita came to lead the narrative and culture change strategy work at Caring Across Generations in 2017. Ishita, thank you for joining us. And sitting next to you at the virtual table is Dr. Abdul El Said, who is a physician, epidemiologist, educator, and public communicator. He's a contributing editor at The New Republic, a CNN commentator, and host of the Crooked Media podcast, America Dissected. His 3 books include Healing Politics, Calling for a Politics of Empathy to Cure Our Epidemics of Insecurity, and Medicare for All, A Citizen's Guide with Dr. Micah Johnson. Dr. El Said is formerly the health director of the city of Detroit and candidate for the governor of Michigan in 2018. So, Dr. El Said, Abdul, Ishita, thank you guys so much for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to you, Drew, to lead us in this amazing discussion. Again, please use the chat if you have any questions. We will try to answer them as much as possible.
Great, thank you, Kalia. And I won't talk much here. I'm going to pretty quickly kick things over, Ishta and Abdul, to the two of you. I would encourage you, if you have reflections on each other's comments, please don't hesitate just to jump in, respond. This really is intended to be an open conversation. We're looking forward to getting your thoughts. So with that, maybe I'll kind of open things up with a very general question, and I'll pose it to both of you, which is, what's the most interesting and important thing about this finding that systemic thinking is rising, albeit perhaps unevenly across issues and groups? What do you find most interesting and important about this? And maybe Ishita, I can start with you.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks so much, Frameworks. First, thank you for doing this incredible research. When I heard about this project, I was like, oh, this is what I was kind of thinking about, waiting for, just in terms of how we, determine the work we're doing around culture and narrative change moving forward in the context of everything that's happened in the last 2 years. So thank you for doing this work. That's going to be incredibly helpful for all of us in the sort of movement space. And thanks for this conversation and for having me here. I mean, I'm going to state the obvious here. The most important thing is that there is a general rise in systemic thinking. In the American mindset, I think so at Caring Across Generations, I work on changing kind of the cultural landscape attitudes and sort of social norms around how we value care and caregiving in the context of care in the home. So that means sort of long-term care of people with disabilities, of our older adults in our lives, but also care of children and anybody else who has a chronic illness. And one of the main kind of norms that we're trying to shift is moving people from thinking about caregiving as a private, personal burden that families are just supposed to kind of figure out on their own, to thinking about it as a collective responsibility, as a pressing social issue, as something that needs public solutions. So, something that I thought would be, I still think probably will be, but I thought would be sort of a 50-year at least norm change battle has been accelerated, I think, a little bit in these 2 years, moving people closer to the systemic mindset is something that I work on every day. I've been working on it for at least 5 years at Caring Across. And so I think the most interesting thing is that there has been an acceleration in that, and that it hasn't maybe drastically dropped yet, at least in your graphs, December 2021. So I think that's the most important thing. And then obviously what actually we do with that at this point. And when I say we, I mean, yes, my organization at Caring Across, but also people working across sort of race, economic inequality, healthcare, kind of all of our kind of joint social movements that I believe this is kind of the one mindset narrative that if we can successfully change, we can actually make huge interventions, both in terms of how people look at the root causes of the problems we're dealing with, but how we start to envision solutions. And I'm really excited to talk more about the solutions piece, but I'll hand it to you, Abdul, to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, first of all, thank you to the Frameworks team and Drew and Kalia for bringing us together. Ishta, it's exciting to sit across the virtual table with you. There were a couple of pieces that really struck me around questions that immediately came to my mind that I'll share here because they may be fruitful for conversation, which is, when do people start to see the system? And to me, when you walk into a functioning system, you don't tend to see it. You see the outcomes of the system. The problem is when the system fails. And so as people are starting to think systemically, it may be because of a set of interventions on our culture and our conversation, but it may also be because our system is starting to fail more people in more profound ways. And the thing about failure is that it is, we are less likely as ego-driven people to give credit to a system when we succeed, and more likely to give credit to a system when we fail or things are not working well for us. And so I think as the system is starting to fail more and more people in more profound ways, whether it's the cost of healthcare or the cost of education, or the fact that your kid's school looks exactly like it did 30 years ago when you went there, or it's the fact that you tell your kid to go to college, but you can't afford it and they can't afford it. Or it's the fact that, even on a post-college graduate salary, they can't afford to move out of the home. All of these things point to a certain failure of our system. And I think it may be why folks are starting to think a little bit more broadly, because they're seeing the seams between it and the cracks in which folks are falling. So in that respect, it may point to a broader structural reality that people are starting to see only because they're falling through its cracks. The other is, as an epidemiologist, we're taught to think about age, period, and cohort effects, right? So when you think about how something changes over time, people are also aging over time. So there's the fact that people change as they age, there's the fact that time changes things, and then there's a whole cohort that is moving through time and aging at the same time. And one of the aspects that to me is really quite startling is the degree to which young people today are thinking systemically. And connected to the last point I tried to make about where systems fail, you think about the experience of young people and the degree to which the failures of the system are falling upon them. It's really quite profound, because obviously we don't have this evidence from earlier, but it seems to me that when you talk to older people about how they thought about the world when they were young, there was a level of individual agency that they took for granted. If I work hard, if I study hard, I will be able to. And I think young people today are recognizing that, that almost a lot of these individual efforts that they make are so predicated upon the system working for them that they're starting to be forced to look systemically. So I think about, I'm 37 years old. I think about, just my life course. I was a junior in high school during 9/11, which kicked off a series of wars that still are not over. If you think about the drone war and the drone machine that's operating. I graduated college into the worst financial recession in modern history in 2007. I trying to raise my first child in the middle of a pandemic. And I'm decidedly one of the lucky ones. I'm one of the ones for whom the system has delivered. And so in that respect, it's easy to understand why young people see the system for what it is, considering that I'm a millennial. I think about Gen Z and the impact that's having on them. The last point I want to make on this is just the role of the internet as a conversational tool. And I think it has had profound impacts on the way that we organize, the way that we think about our collective discourse, the speed at which culture changes and shifts. But I also think that one of the challenges with the internet is not that it has eliminated the sense of individual strength or failure, but that it has tried to encapsulate systems changes as the beings and doings of individuals. And so I wonder, how we tell a systems story in modern times in 280 characters, because it tends to sort of fall into, well, this person sort of kicked the system and broke it this way, rather than actually asking a broader set of questions about incentives and the roles of a political economy in shaping a system, who it delivers for and who it fails rather purposely. And so I think people are thinking about systems, but I worry that they're thinking about systems and stories. And sometimes that may not be as effective as what we'd like. And at the same time, it is a truth of the human mind that we communicate in stories. And so what stories we tell about how systems work is really critical. But it is, we're dealing with a fundamental incoherence, because stories are about individuals, but systems are about collectives and movements. And so how we tell the story of a system becomes really important. And I worry that sometimes the internet does that work for us, but sometimes translates the system's points in stories that are not necessarily coherent to the way the system actually operates. And so that's another question I was left with.
So those are both fantastic questions. So Ishita, I see you unmute. I was going to go to you immediately if you have any follow-ups. When that question you asked Abdul about how to tell stories that are system stories, knowing how your expertise, Ishita, on narrative and story and systems thinking, I'm sure you have reflections. I'll just stop. I would love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, Abdul, you sort of posed what I think is the perfect question in terms of kind of one of the things we can do with this research and with the findings and where we go from here. a couple of thoughts. I think someone even asked this question in the chat. But one of the things I read was in the research was that, there's the idea that this finding does not apply to health, what you mentioned, Drew. And then this, the idea that like this research was done in a global pandemic, and that the systems thinking did not shift when it comes to health. And that a lot of the news coverage around COVID during this time really reinforced the narrative of the individual. The individual sort of in the United States, I should clarify, because that was not the case in sort of other news coverage around the pandemic in other parts of the world. And we have this unique, situation that people around the world were dealing with the exact same thing at the exact same time. And we can actually look at news coverage and storytelling about the pandemic and see that in the States, the news coverage was really focused on the individual, how the individual can protect themselves, being vaccinated, staying home. That was kind of the primary focus of news coverage, but also a lot of like the health campaigns. And so I think that the answer, well, although I think there is a way, I'm not sure about doing it on Twitter, but I think there is a way to have a coordinated effort where multiple sort of narrative avenues are moving this narrative forward, around sort of the collective mindset, around the sort of systemic mindset. And I really think it works better for solutions. I'm using the term solutions kind of broadly, but for solutions than it does for kind of root causes, because people actually are hungry for ways out. And placing the onus always on the individual is actually really difficult for whether it's young people or, in the context of my work, older folks who can't afford long-term care, who can't afford to age at home. Placing that onus on them, placing the blame on them for not having earned enough their whole lives to be able to afford that, is actually like something that people they don't want to think like that. So when we offer alternate solutions in the form of narratives, I think we found, and this is sort of a segueing into another question, but we found that we've been kind of posing the collective mindset solution in stories we tell about caregiving in our work for 5 years. And only in the last year have we seen people leaning in to those solutions more than they did before. So I think, so again, to go back to that, I don't think a single story is the answer. I think we actually need a coordinated effort where multiple folks on multiple levels who hold the power of sort of reaching people through pop culture are actually, in a concerted fashion, moving the narrative forward, that we need collective solutions to things, that root causes are often systemic and not individual, and really moving away from this kind of individualistic narrative. I've done a little bit of sort of looking and digging into where these narratives come from. And if you think about it, it's not one story that led to the myth of the individual becoming the dominant American narrative. It's been reinforced for like hundreds of years through kind of seminal myths, be it religion, be it pop culture, everywhere in between, ads. I mean, and so we can't kind of change it through one story, but the same way that this narrative has been reinforced for hundreds of years through multiple stories, in a way that served sort of capitalism and a lot of the other systems that hold up this country. I think in that same way, we need a concerted effort to do kind of storytelling at the narrative level. And I really think sort of ads and Hollywood are really the way to go. And that's kind of the work that I'm doing in collaboration with a bunch of other movement organizations to try to move some of these dominant narratives forward at that level. And I do think that over time, that is how we can continue to kind of cement this rise in systemic thinking.
I wanted to just pick up on the point that you made about health, and the pandemic was a really just a unfortunate but also fascinating exercise in how we think about what makes us healthy. And I'm an epidemiologist by training. I ran a health department and hosted a podcast about the pandemic. And the frustrating piece about all of this is that public health, by definition, is collective action. It literally is what we as a collective do to assure conditions for people to be healthy. And the problem is that we immediately sieved it down to the lowest common denominator of what we as individuals could do alone to keep ourselves healthy. The mask discourse, the vaccine discourse, right, immediately became, this is about what I can do. And what's fascinating about that is that it didn't necessarily have to tip that way, because the idea around a mask mandate or a vaccine mandate is that we're all collectively healthier if all of us do the thing we need to do. And what's fascinating is we literally saw the individual discourse about masks and vaccines emerge out of this to decimate the collective part, which is to say, when someone says, well, I don't want to get vaccinated, or I don't want to wear a mask because I have a right to my own choice on this, what they're basically saying is, by definition, all of your collective interventions are actually only individual interventions. And so you almost saw the individualistic interpretation of those interventions like gobble up the collective interpretation. And we were unable, frankly, to adequately explain that collective aspect, because they were individual things that individuals need to do, let alone the question of things like contact tracing and some of these other interventions that had failed from the jump because we just hadn't invested in the infrastructure. And so the point that you made about the health piece was really important. And so the other question that I think we ought to be asking is, what is the counter narrative that we have to be braced against, right? Because that was exactly it, right? We can all say we're all in this together, which we all know not everybody was in it the same way. But we can say we're all in this together. We're all doing this thing to protect one another. It's a collective thing. And that individual interpretation of that collective thing then undermines that collective part. And so we just have to be thoughtful about what are the broader individual counter narratives that are posed against the collective narrative that we're trying to offer. Because that's, I think, the way that individualism works. It undermines. It doesn't actually hit head on. It just undermines a collective narrative. It says, well, I can do it by myself. Why do I need a park or a community pool when I could build a pool in my backyard? And I have a backyard big enough that other people, I don't need to have other people come and hang out in my park, right? And I think that's the way that it sort of works, and it sort of chips away the collective piece. And once you have enough people chipping away at the collective, it's no longer a collective effort, and it's every person for themselves. And I think so many of the systems failures that we're seeing, right, they get undermined in this particular way, which should force us to ask, how do you build a narrative that is protected from that kind of undermining, that has a response to the individual adduct of the thing that you're trying to build.
So fantastic. This is a fantastic conversation. I'm really curious in the kind of going forward here to think about something you both have already touched on, which are both kind of the implications of this finding, this rise in systemic thinking for movement strategy moving forward, as well as we continue this project, as we continue the research, where we ought to be going, what we could find out that would be useful for the movement. So in the interest of kind of keeping an open conversation, I want to kind of put those together. There are a lot of directions we could go with it. You already have touched on a few of them, this question about counter narratives, and this underlying question that you both are raising of how to build, how to create a system story going forward that helps to maybe leverage this opening, take advantage of it, and push it further. So that was a lot. I want to kind of maybe start with this question of implications, and maybe Ishtai can go to you for that. You've already touched on this, but what implications do you think this finding has for movement strategies moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, sort of not, I don't want to kind of repeat what I said before, but I want to just pull out a couple of things. One thing that I saw in the research was, again, that certain groups are leaning more into sort of the systemic thinking. I think you mentioned the age piece, but I also think I saw in the research that African-American communities, obviously no surprises there. I don't know what it looked like before the last 2 years, but my guess is maybe those communities were leaning into the systemic sort of approaches even before the last 2 years, just given the depth of sort of racism and structural racism in this country. But one thing that we found in focus groups, for example, that we've done on solutions to people's struggles with family caregiving is that African American communities, even before these last 2 years, were far quicker to think about community solutions. So moving past the individual, past the family, into the community, and then to sort of government solutions than other groups were. And this is something we found, again, before sort of just these last 2 years. And in these last 2 years, that group has expanded from what we've seen. So there are many sort of, as everybody here knows, there are many communities that already practice kind of the community model of care in this country. It may not be the dominant culture, it may not be sort of structurally supported, but many communities practice that. And one thing, Abdul, to your point, I really appreciated the way you kind of laid out kind of the collective narratives kind of swallowing up the individual narrative. But I will say that from looking at what kinds of memes, what kinds of sort of like GIFs and videos were kind of getting traction in that first pandemic summer, there was this mutual aid society, this sort of neighborhood community, this idea that like my safety is connected to yours. There was a little bit of that kind of content, and we were part of a group of folks, comedians, people really trying to push that kind of content out. I will say it was getting more traction than it had before. And so again, to go to your question, Drew, there's kind of 2 points I'm trying to make here. One is there are communities that have been practicing sort of moving past the individual and the family, and that are able to envision government solutions. So the other point that we kind of didn't really talk about is the role of the government and how, within this context, the role of the government is shifting a little bit. There's still a lot of mistrust. People often don't see the good things that the government does. And so, but in talking about what we do with this moving forward, so like what implications this has for the work I do is two very clear things. One is we are in conversation with other organizations that work with the entertainment industry and also work with ad agencies and TikTok influencers and sort of people that have cultural influence in how to move these dominant narratives forward. And I feel like this research and this finding has given us a little more, I hate using violent metaphors, but ammunition, like to go into writers' rooms, to go to executives in the entertainment industry and say, look, this is kind of what we have seen in the last 2 years. This is where we have a huge opportunity right now to actually cement these narratives and to be very specific about which audience groups we want to work with. So there are young people who are already thinking like this. Let's find influencers on TikTok who we can sort of work with to hone that narrative because they have huge followings. Let's find African-American community leaders who are already talking about both, and I don't want to kind of gloss over the root causes of sort of all of our inequities. And so, we can talk about the sort of systemic root causes while also talking about solutions and actually talk to people with cultural influence to make sure that they are pushing these narratives forward. And my role here, or the role of other kind of cultural strategists who sit next to me at other organizations, is to kind of serve as those translators and middle people to take this research and bring it to those folks with cultural influence to figure out how we can move this narrative forward in a concerted way.
That's great. And so we want to offer a few minutes at the end here to open things up for questions. So maybe before we do that, Abdul, I can kick things to you if you want to reflect on that question about strategic implications or what you would find useful for us to find out going forward that would really help, as Ishta, you were saying, kind of figure out how to cement this rise in systemic thinking and take advantage of this opportunity. So Abdul, over to you if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, first I just want to say I really appreciate Ishita's point about how you drive a narrative in media. The place that I'm thinking about it is how do you in the context of an extremely polarized and polarizing America, how do you, in a political space, have a conversation that is actually persuasive to the people we need to persuade? And I worry increasingly, particularly, obviously from the progressive perspective, we tend to do more and more talking to people who already agree with us in political discourse. And so the question I keep thinking about is, how do you tell conventional stories about the problems that people face that don't amount to, and then people pull themselves up by the bootstraps and solve their problem? It is, and this is why we need to have one another's backs. And then what are the metaphors that we can grab culturally that have resonance to people in the middle and on the right to talk about spaces where collectivity works? And so from a political standpoint, in the campaigning standpoint, that is what we need to be asking. How do we translate these stories, pulling from cultural metaphors that come together? And what I found is that oftentimes, so many of the metaphors that are used have collective implications in them, but we ignore them because they're told in a particular way, right? So, I got family who grew up as farmers, and the thing they'll tell you is that no farming gets done because a few people, worked hard on their own. A lot of farming happens because everybody pitches in and works hard together. Now, that tends to be told in a way where, the farm is self-reliant and it's you and your brothers and your sisters, and they're the only ones. But actually, right, anybody who's ever worked the farm knows that farming communities are extremely interdependent. And so how do we start borrowing from the sort of metaphor space that exists in the middle and in context of the country where we've tended to be losing power for collective solutions, and use them to highlight, right, the collectivity implicit in what they're doing, to make broader arguments about what we as a country ought to do. The other question that we have to have, and this is, this is the sort of subtext of the really powerful book, Some of Us, is that people are fine investing in collectives so long as the collective includes everybody who looks like them and doesn't include people who don't look like them. So how do we come together around trying to build into the narrative of collectivity a certain ability to withstand what is going to be a racially divisive wedge argument, right? Yes, for us, but not for them. And if you sort of look at where the populist right has tended to go, it is actually tended toward collective solutions, but collective solutions that are explicitly exclusive of people of color. And so, beyond even thinking around systems and collectives, we also have to be asking, well, why is it that we have to be inclusive of all groups of people in these solutions for the solutions to truly work? And to do it without saying words like intersectional, which tend to then connote a certain way of speaking that tends to be exclusive of people who you're trying to persuade in the first place. And so I think this is really, really helpful in terms of recognizing the value of highlighting systems and highlighting collectives, but also trying to translate that into metaphors that are themselves immune to racialization on the right, and also borrowing of narratives that may be persuasive for folks for whom their narratives have only been used to justify an individualistic approach to the world.
I know we're kind of at time. I didn't answer your second question, Drew, and based on what you said, Abdul, but also based on a lot of the chat, I just wanted to name that I think what would be really helpful, selfishly for me, but I think for many of us doing this work, is actually testing out as another step to this research, actually doing some deep kind of narrative metaphor kind of testing around what within these groups of people, what are some possible stories, what are some possible narratives that would work, that might have resonance, that won't have resonance, that might turn folks off, just so that we and we've been doing some of this ourselves, but I think there's a lot more that we could be doing to test narratives that then we can take to storytellers and say, hey, here's the stuff that your audiences are resonating with right now around a collective mindset, and here's some directions we can go.
I think that's a great place to conclude. We actually do have, I'm excited to say, as part of this project moving forward, an opportunity to start to do some of that narrative and frame testing. And I'm really excited for that going forward. I have so many more questions for both of you, but I'm going to stop there and hand things back to Clea so we can get at least a few questions from participants.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Ishita and Abdul. The chat has been blowing up and you guys have been throwing so many good questions into the Q&A. I'm going to try to condense a few that seemed similar, and also let you guys know that the conversation is not over. At the end of this hour, we will be having more roundtables and continuing to update and have this conversation as the findings come through. So please, and stay in conversation with us on social media as always. So some questions that I saw repeated. Specifically, what is the role of mainstream media in people's thinking and this kind of individualism versus systemic thinking? And then in this kind of fake news world we live in, what do we do with that? Like, how do we respond to that? Anybody can answer.
Well, I guess, what I would say to that, which is not directly maybe answering the question, but all of the media we consume is intentionally created by folks for a particular reason. And so I think that, I mean, people are not walking into their stories completely unaware of the narratives they're putting out. And I think that holds as true for a network TV show as it does for somebody on Fox News as it might for someone creating a video on that's going viral on WhatsApp or Facebook. So, I mean, I'm not saying every single person that creates every piece of content knows exactly what they're doing, but I kind of want to say there are people, many people are telling stories because they want to tell stories, but they're also telling stories because they have believed certain things to be true. They believe certain ideas that they want to share with other people. And so if I think the answer here is, and I kind of want to, there's a question that was also asked around which audiences we should be talking to. Should we only be talking to the people that are already, and Abdul, you raised this as well. Are we only talking to the people that already believe what we believe? Are we talking to the other people? I think we need a very strategic plan in general for what kinds of content we intentionally create to reach which groups of people and which messages resonate with them. And for example, we have for caregiving, for our culture change work on caregiving, we have segmented audience groups who are our persuadables. These are folks that we believe for a whole host of reasons based on research can be moved to think about care as something that needs public solutions, but they don't think that yet, but they can be moved. And so the content, we partnered with the TV show This Is Us on ABC to reach them because they watched that show and it already had caregiving themes. We also believe that our base of younger folks and of African-American folks, we also need to energize them with solutions. We need to equip them with narratives around solutions. So we reach them on TikTok. We don't reach our persuadables on TikTok. And I think that's just to say that like we can have a narrative strategy that is different for different groups of people, and that then we take different kind of tested sort of metaphors and narratives to different storytellers and have conversations about why these narratives need to be moved forward. And so again, this is not an easy task. I don't mean to make it sound like we can do this in 6 months, but I just, that's kind of my answer to the fake news thing is we just need to create a different content and pump even more money into that content than the folks who are putting out the fake news are doing.
I really love that point. The only thing I'm going to add is just to say that, there is a lot of what drives attention. And frankly, all of media is an attention economy. Somebody is selling something on the back end of that attention, a subscription or an ad. A lot of the attention, easy ploys for attention tend to be around sensationalism, and they tend to be around the narratives of what individuals did. And I think there is an opportunity to do a couple of things. I think there's a real thirst for a different tone I have a lot of, I take a lot of inspiration from Ted Lasso and the fact that that show did a lot better than anybody thought it would. And it's not angry, it's not frustrating. It's just about a person trying to be a good dude in the world. And I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of trying to show the joy and the benefit of collective reasoning and engagement and what we can do when we work together. People want to live in that world. And then the second is an appreciation for the fact that a lot of what we consume in the media is not an accurate portrayal of what is being consumed. We live in bubbles. We have been already sorted into bubbles. And so what we're consuming is it's consumed as a function of what we prefer, whether it's online, whether it's on television, et cetera. And so it is worth, as people who are thinking about this, to expose oneself to other conversations that are not necessarily being had, and to ask, if I were to say what I wanted to say in the form of this media, what would that look like? And then start to do that a little bit more. And so, a lot of this can be moved in terms of conversations with everything from bookers on cable news or local news. But I do think that there is a space here to ask, all right, how do we show the upside of working together? And then how do we start speaking in ways that are not native to our own media bubble?
All right, thank you guys for that. So I'm looking at time, I'm looking at our questions. We have some good questions, but also I am committed to getting us out of here on time, like we said we were going to do. So with that said, I will just quickly, Drew, I don't know if you have like a 30-second answer to this question. I saw a few times in both the chat and the Q&A, but are there frames already or metaphors already that we know work around collectivism that can be used and tested with this group of people right now? Is there anything that somebody can kind of walk away with?
Give me that in 30 seconds, Kalia. So I love it. We have tons of research across issues. There's a way in which I would encourage people to go to our website. There's a way in which all of our work is at base. The meta task is to find ways of effectively communicating systemically about different issues. A lot of what we found in the past is somewhat issue specific. We often find architecture metaphors can be really helpful in giving people a sense of a design system. So there are some threads that work across issues, but there are also a lot of specific framing moves that are issue specific. So I think the key thing is to be attentive to not reinforcing that sense that it's the individual who's driving things, making sure that you're telling stories that bring context into view, make the system very visible to people. That is something that we often don't do because we all have habits. Bootstrap stories are really familiar to all of us. So in some ways, it's being attentive to the stories that we are telling in our own framing to be really intentional. I hope that as we move forward with this project, we do have some of those recommendations that are a bit more cross-cutting. So lots more to say going forward, but that's my best, probably more than 30-second answer.
That was perfect timing. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Ishita. Thank you, Abdul. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Please don't rush off just yet. I have a few things I want to say to you guys. First and foremost, I need you, if you don't mind, to look at the lovely screen, which I'm going to make bigger as soon as I figure out how to do that. Aha. That didn't get any bigger. Can you guys see that? There you go. Take your little phone camera thing, scan the QR code. That's going to take you right to the feedback form for today's webinar. It's 3 questions. It's 5 minutes. If that, please, please, please fill it out for us. Do not forget that we are now in community together. The conversation continues online. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter. We don't have Instagram yet. I just remembered that. But go follow us online and use the hashtag culture change to continue the conversation. We have recorded all of your questions. If you are still interested in reading more, then you can follow those links that we have put in the chat with the reports. And if you found this conversation interesting and you want to know more right away, up to date, then you can follow this link. And that's where you're going to be updated on everything culture change related. So thank you again very, very much. This is the first of 3 roundtables in this series. So please, now that you're a part of our community, come to the next one, tell your friends, share the things you've learned, and enjoy the rest of your day. I know we could have been talking here for hours, people, but we're going to honor lunchtime. Thank you, everybody. Have a good one.